Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to my Enterprise Linux Security series. In this episode, episode number 2 of the series, I'm going to walk you through 5 things that you can change on your server right now to strengthen its security. Now, to be fair, what I'm going to walk you through is not going to make your servers hack-proof, but these are 5 things, they're easy things that you could do right now to strengthen the security of your servers, and I'm going to walk you through each one. I'm excited to get right into it, but before I do, I want to mention the sponsor for today's video, Cloud Linux. And they have a new service available called Extended Lifecycle Support that enables you to keep your end-of-life distributions going for just a little bit longer. Perhaps you need just a little bit more time to upgrade to a newer version, and if that's the case, then Extended Lifecycle Support is something that you might want to consider. And here on this page, we can see some of the features that are being advertised. It mentions that patches are available soon after CVEs go public. The setup process is easy and straightforward. It gives you kernel and critical package updates. And this is very important right here. ELS gives you an additional 4 years beyond the end-of-life date from the vendor. And the pricing starts at $3.60 US dollars per server. And from what I found, it actually is the cheapest option available today, which is awesome. And it supports multiple distributions as well. For example, right here, they advertise CentOS, Oracle, Ubuntu, and Debian. And Debian is currently in the planning stage at this time, but this service is already available for CentOS 6, Oracle 6, and Ubuntu 16.04. And if you are currently running one of those distributions, then that means you no longer have support for security patches from your vendor anymore. Extended Lifecycle Support can keep your end-of-life servers going for a while longer. So if that affects you, then definitely check this out. And thank you to Cloud Linux for their continued support of Learn Linux TV. I really appreciate it. Now, without any further ado, let's get into my 5 tweaks for securing your Linux server. Alright, so here I am on an Ubuntu server that is running in the cloud. And I've just created this server. I haven't yet integrated any of my security tweaks that I normally integrate to secure a server. This one is completely vanilla. And as you can see here, the specific version of Ubuntu that I'm running is Ubuntu 20.04.2 LTS. I usually recommend LTS releases for most people, because the security updates are available for a longer period of time on an LTS release than other versions of Ubuntu. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into some security tweaks. Now, the very first problem is that I am currently running as root. Now, normally, when it comes to Ubuntu, they actually lock the Ubuntu user when you install Ubuntu on your server. But when it comes to cloud providers, they often unlock the root account, and that's the account that they have you use when you set up a VPS instance like I have here. So the first order of business, at least for me, is to create a non-root user. Now again, if you have installed Ubuntu yourself, then this step is already completed because generally speaking, Ubuntu locks the root user by default. And typically the root user is unlocked when it comes to cloud providers versions of Ubuntu. So anyway, what I'm going to do is run add user, and then I'll give it the name of the user that I want to create. I'll just create the user as my first name, J, just like that. So add user and then J. Now, if you are not logged in as root and you want to create a secondary user aside from the user that you already have, then what you'll need to do is add sudo in front of the command. But since I'm currently logged in as root, I don't have to do that. So it's going to have me create a password for that user. Just make sure that it's super secure. I'll type it again. And for these prompts that are about to come up, you could actually answer these, but I'm going to leave them blank for now. So full name, enter, room number, work phone. Just going to keep pressing enter. And then it's asking me, is this information correct? Yes, it is. I'll just press enter to accept the default of yes. And that's why the Y is capital, because that's the default. So now I actually have a non-root user that I can use to log into the server. But I should also make sure that my new user account has access to sudo, because I don't want to use the root account unless I absolutely have to. So enabling sudo will allow me to execute commands as root from my normal user account. So it's pretty important that I do that. And by default, access to sudo in Ubuntu is controlled by the sudo group. If a user is a member of that group, then they'll be able to use sudo. So what I could do is run usermod -a and then capital G, because I want to add a user to a group. And the group that I want to add a user to is the sudo group. Again, this is Ubuntu specific. Other distributions will use a group of a different name, such as wheel, for example. But anyway, the user that I want to add to the sudo group is the one that I just created, J. So the command looks like that. I'll press enter. And I can confirm that my user is a member of the sudo group by running groups and then J. And you can see that sudo is among the options there. So if I was to switch over to J, I could type su hyphen and then the user. And it didn't actually prompt me for the password for my user because root is the super user. Root can do anything. So root doesn't need a password to switch to a different user. But as you can see, I am logged in as my local user J. So I could run a command as sudo. So I could do sudo ls/etc, which is a very simple command to make sure that sudo works. I'll press enter. And it's going to ask me for my password, which I have just entered. And you can see that the ls command worked. If I didn't have access to sudo, then I wouldn't have seen the output of the ls command. And since I do see that, that confirms that sudo is working just fine. So what I want to do at this point is log out completely, so I can hold Control and press D to disconnect, which brings me back to root. And then I'll hold Control and press D again to log out of SSH completely. So now I'm logged out of that server. So that's the command that I used to SSH into the server in the beginning. So I'm going to change the username to my name. Because again, I don't want to use root unless I absolutely have to. Type in my password. And as you can see, I am logged into the server as my local user account. Now, another thing that we need to do in order to strengthen the security of our Linux server is make sure that we have all security patches installed and ready to go. Even if we are using an automatic patching solution such as kernel care, it makes sense to start from a known good state or a fully updated state. So the first thing I'm going to do is run sudo apt update, and this is not going to actually update the packages, but what it will do is refresh its understanding of what's available to be updated. So I'll press enter. And now it's refreshing its package index. Usually this is pretty quick. And at the bottom there, it is telling me that 42 packages can be upgraded. So in order to actually install those updates, we can run sudo apt and then dist-upgrade, basically a distribution upgrade. And this command is also the same for Debian as well. And by executing this command, it should install all of the packages that are available to be updated. Let's see what happens. I'll press enter. And as you can see right here, it's going to update quite a few things. So I'm going to press enter to accept the default of yes. I'll let this run, and then I'll be back as soon as it's done. All right, so the update process is complete. Now, what I like to do at this point is reboot the server because I want to make sure that I am actually taking advantage of all of the updates, some of which do require a reboot, unless you are using something like Kernel Care Enterprise, in which case you don't actually have to reboot. But this is a brand new server. I haven't loaded Kernel Care Enterprise yet. So what I'm going to do is reboot it so that I am starting from a fully updated server before I build this server out to be whatever it's going to be, like a web server or proxy or something like that. Having a fully updated package database will just give me the best possible starting point. So I will type sudo and then reboot, and that's going to reboot the server. And I'm going to give this server a few minutes to start back up, and then I'll be right back. All right, so let's see if the reboot is finished and the server is back online. So far, so good. And now I am logged back into the server. Let's continue. So next, what I'm going to walk you through is how to install unattended upgrades in Ubuntu. Now, this is actually a different service than something like Kernel Care Enterprise. Kernel Care Enterprise will give you live patching. Unattended upgrades will not. But if you don't have a subscription to something like Kernel Care Enterprise, then unattended upgrades is a really good thing to have nonetheless. And it's actually very easy to install and set up. So what I'm going to do is run sudo apt install, and then the package I want to install is unattended-upgrades. Just like that. I'll press enter. I'll type in my super secret password. Preferably, I'll type it in correctly. There we go. And on this particular image for this VPS provider, unattended upgrades is already installed. So now that it's already installed, how do we configure it then? So what I'm going to do is go into the etc directory, and inside there we have an apt directory, and underneath that we have the apt.conf.d directory as well. And if I list the storage, we have quite a few files here. And before we continue, we should ensure that automatic upgrades are enabled. And the command that we can run to actually enable that is this one right here. Sudo dpkg-reconfigure -- priority equals low unattended-upgrades. And when you press enter, it's going to ask you at least one question. And for me, it only asked me this question. It wants to know if the server should automatically download and install stable updates. And yes, that's exactly what I want. So the cursor is already on the answer yes. I'll press enter. And that's virtually it. And inside this directory, we have quite a few files. So what I'm going to do is use the nano text editor. It really doesn't matter what text editor you use, but we need to edit some files. And the 20 auto upgrades file is the first one that we're going to take a look at. Now, for this particular file, you will need at least these two lines. So what this means is that, first of all, we are enabling the package list to be automatically refreshed. That's the first line. And the second line is enabling the automatic installation of those updates. So not a lot to configure here, just those two lines. So I'm going to hold Control and press X to exit out. I didn't make any changes here. That file should already be populated when we ran the reconfigure command. So next I'll run sudo nano. I want to edit yet another file. This time I want to edit 50 unattended upgrades. That's the next file that we need to edit. I'll press enter. And here it is. And this one is quite a bit longer than the other one. So let's scroll down a bit and look for some things that we might want to change. So this first section right here, allowed origins, is basically where we decide what type of updates we actually want to have. So security and infra-security are already there. Now, alternatively, we could enable the other sources as well, but the whole point of this video is security specific. And updates, proposed, and backports, those repositories aren't actually going to be security specific, so it's up to you if you want to enable those. I don't necessarily recommend it unless you do want to have feature updates be automatic as well, so I'm going to leave this section alone. So I'll keep scrolling a bit. Now this option right here, completely optional. But you could set it up to install updates only on shutdown. This isn't something that I normally turn on, but it is there if that's something that you want. Now this line right here gives you the ability to have an email sent to you anytime unattended upgrades actually upgrade something. This does require the ability for outbound mail to be set up on your server, which in and of itself could be a security risk. As long as you do have that locked down, you should be fine, but that's beyond the scope of this video. But if you do have an email address that you want to receive updates to anytime this runs, then what you could do is uncomment this, and then inside the double quotes right here, you could type your email address, whatever that happens to be, just like that. So I'll scroll down. Let's see what else we have here. Now, similar to the above, this has to do with email alerts. And if we uncomment this, we can control when we actually get an email from this service. Now, by default, it's going to email you anytime there's any kind of change. Now, if you have tens of thousands of servers, you're going to get a lot of email. What you might want to consider, just like it says in the line above, is changing this to only on error. That way, if everything is fine, you won't get an alert, but if there's a problem, you will. Now be careful with this though. You might want to consider leaving this set to on change, because if the service fails, then you might actually think that nothing is wrong, because if it fails at a level that's below the unattended upgrades, and unattended upgrades doesn't even run in any way, shape, or form, you could actually think that your server is being updated, and it's actually not. So that's the trade-off. I'll leave that up to you. Now this line right here, I do uncomment that line, because every now and then you will get a new kernel installed as part of an upgrade, and over time those older kernels will take up space. I've actually seen servers have their boot partition filled up just because of this alone. Now I've uncommented this and it's set to true, and what that means is that after a while it's going to actually clean up unused kernels, which will help prevent that kind of thing from happening. So I do recommend that you uncomment this line. And similarly, I also uncomment this one as well. And most likely these are default and will work regardless of whether or not they're commented out if you don't change their settings, but I like to be explicit. And every now and then when you install upgrades on your server, there might be unused dependencies, and what this will do is just clean those up. So that way you don't have your entire server cluttered by packages that you are not using, which actually benefits security, because the fewer packages that you have installed, the better. And pretty much the same thing here as well. We definitely want to keep our server clean. Now this line right here, you might want to pay special attention to this. Now you can uncomment this, and you should. It's set to false by default, but what this will do is automatically reboot your server once automatic updates have finished. Now, if this is a production server and you are a 24/7 operation, then you probably don't want to set this to true. However, if you do have a maintenance window at the end of the night or maybe in the middle of the night where you don't mind the server rebooting, it can only benefit you to set this to true. If you are using something like Kernel Care Enterprise, then you really shouldn't have to do this at all. But I'll leave it up to you. It just depends on whether or not you are a 24/7 operation. If you can deal with a few minutes of downtime in the middle of the night, then maybe this is something that you should enable, in which case you will set this to true. And this line right here is going to do the same thing, but it's going to do it also when users are still logged into the server. So think of it this way. If you have a maintenance window, say 2 in the morning, and it's okay for the server to reboot after updating at that time, but since that's your maintenance window, if you have an administrator logged into that server that's doing actual work, you may not want the server to reboot if someone is logged in. I'll leave that up to you to specify that. It really depends on your operation and how you have things structured. And right here, we have the unattended upgrade reboot time. So if you do have it set up to automatically reboot your server when upgrades have been applied, then this will allow you to set the time that the server actually reboots. It defaults to 2 in the morning. If that's okay for your maintenance window, you can leave it set to 2 in the morning. That's not a bad time, but I'll leave that up to you. Whatever time you think is fair for the server to reboot, if you don't have a live patching solution, that's up to you. Now there's all kinds of different options here, and I'm not going to go over all of them. Those are some of the highlights. So what I'm going to do is hold Control and press O to save the file. I'll press Enter, and then I'll hold Control and press X to exit out, and the changes should take effect immediately. So at this point, we have automatic upgrades enabled. What else can we do to start our server off with better security? Well, the next thing that we can do is actually secure SSH. And to get started, I'm actually going to disconnect from my server. I'll just hold Control and press D. And now I'm back to my local computer. And the reason why I disconnected from the server is because I want to create an SSH key that I can use to connect to the server with, rather than using password authentication, which is one of the first things I do when it comes to SSH. So to generate an SSH key, I will type SSH-keygen, just like that. And while I could just press enter right now to accept the defaults, I want to actually customize the key that I'm about to create. Specifically, I want to create a key of a completely different type than the default. So I will add -T, and that will allow me to set the type of key that I want to create. And the type is going to be ED25519, just like that. And without going too into detail about what makes this particular type of key better, it is an elliptic curve key type. It just basically has better security than the default of the RSA type. So I'll press enter. And it's giving me the path right here where it's going to create the key by default. So I'm going to press enter, but before you press enter, just keep in mind that if you have a key at this location already, it's going to be wiped out by this command. Just make sure of that first before you press enter. You don't want to lose an existing key if you have one. So I'll press enter, and now it's asking me for a passphrase. So I can actually create a key with a passphrase, and that adds additional security to the key, or I could press enter to essentially have a key with no passphrase. And I highly recommend that you do use a passphrase with your key. Again, it's optional, but it does add significant value because it gives you additional security. So what I'm going to do is create the passphrase right now. I'll just type in the passphrase that I want it to be, and then I'll type it again. And now it's telling me that the key has been created. So if I list the storage of my home directory, specifically the .ssh directory, you can see that I have these two files right here, id_ed25519, and then also the same file again, but .pub at the end of it. Now the file that's highlighted right now is a public key. It doesn't matter if you show the contents of this key to someone else. In fact, if you want to connect to another person's server to help them out with it, it's actually quite common to give them your public key to allow you access. So what I could do is cat out the contents of that key, and there it is right there. Now again, it's perfectly acceptable to show this key in the public, so there's no problem whatsoever with my YouTube audience seeing this key. But what I should not do under any circumstances is show off the contents of my private key. And this is the private key right here, the file that does not have the .pub extension. So I absolutely should not do this. But I just did. Now here's the thing, I'm going to delete this key as well as the server as soon as I'm done recording this video. That's why I'm able to show you the private key, because the private key is going to be completely deleted. I'm never going to use it, and I'm never going to set up a server to be authenticated with this key after this video is done. The only reason why I'm showing you the contents of this file is just so you can see what a private key generally looks like. But on your end, you should absolutely never, I repeat, never show the contents of your private key to anybody for any reason, and you especially should make sure that your private key is never part of a public software repository either. In fact, I would never even include it in any software repository, even if it's a private repository. If this private key was to ever leak out into the public, then it completely invalidates the key and you can no longer trust it. Just keep that in mind. Now again, in my case, I am going to be wiping this laptop and completely deleting the server I've been using right after I'm done editing this video, so that's why I'm able to show it to you guys, but do as I say, not as I do. So we have an SSH key. Now what can we actually do with it? Well, what I'm going to do right now is run a special command that's going to copy my key over to the server, so that way I can actually use the key to authenticate to my server, which will then enable me to disable password authentication, which is what this is ultimately leading to. So I will recall the SSH command that I've been using to connect to the server, and here it is. And what I'm going to do is change the SSH command to ssh-copy-id, and then I'll add -i, then my home directory, and then I'll type the name of the key, which is that one right there. So take a moment to look at the command to see what I'm doing. I'm using the ssh-copy-id command with the -i option. I'm pointing it to the location of my public key. Then I'm adding my username, and then the IP address of the server. So I'll press enter. Now it's going to ask me for the password to the server. This is not the passphrase. This is the actual password for SSH for the server that I'm trying to connect to. So I will enter that right here. And then I'll press enter. So now it's telling me that the SSH key has been copied over to that server. So what I'm going to do is SSH back into that server. This is the same command I've been using. I'll press enter. And now it's asking me to unlock the private key. And this is where you type in the passphrase. And as you can see, I'm logged back into my server. So what we're going to do is disable the ability to connect to the server via SSH with a password. We want to mandate that the key must be used. That way, anybody who does not have the key won't be able to connect. And there's a very special procedure I like to do for this. So I'm going to leave this session alone, and I'm going to open a new tab. And here I have a new tab. So right here I have the initial session that I logged into. And then here I have the new session. So I'm going to paste in the command that I used to connect to that server. So basically I will be connected to that server in two different tabs. As you can see, I'm connected to that server again here. Now what I want to do is edit the SSH configuration file to disable password authentication. So I will run sudo nano /etc/ssh, then sshd_config. So here we have the sshd config file. This is the config file for the SSH service itself. And there's a few lines of configuration that we will want to change here. So I'm going to scroll down a bit until I find it, until I find the first one. And right here we have permit root login, and it's set to yes. Now this might already be set to no on your end, or it could be set to something else. But what we want to do is set it equal to no. We don't want to allow root login to our servers at all. Keep in mind, we've created a user for ourselves, and we gave our user access to sudo. So we shouldn't actually need the root account anymore. But that's not the main reason why we're in this file. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. And here we have the actual line of configuration that I was looking for. So I'm going to uncomment this by removing the hash symbol in the front. And I'm going to set this equal to no. So what this is going to do is disable password authentication completely, so the key becomes the only way that I'm going to be able to access this server going forward via SSH. So I will hold Control and I'll press O to save the file, Enter, and then Control X. Now the changes don't actually take effect until I restart the SSH service. So I'm going to run sudo systemctl restart sshd, just like that. Now notice I am connected to the server via SSH in both tabs. So I'll press enter. And you can notice that I'm still connected to this server in both tabs. It didn't actually disrupt my connection here, and I'm still connected here as well. So now you might be wondering, why did I actually have you guys open up two tabs to the same server? Well, the reason is I'm going to have you disconnect in one of the tabs. So I'm going to hold Control and press D. And now I've logged out of the server. But I'm still logged into this one. Now the thing is, I've restarted the SSH service. If I made a mistake, if something went wrong, I won't be able to get back into the server again. That's why I kept this session open. So if I made a mistake, when I go to try it again in the other tab, then I still have this session that I can use to fix the problem if there is a problem. So here in this tab, what I'm going to do is try to connect back into the server. And it lets me right in. It didn't ask me for a password, which makes sense. I disabled that. But what's interesting is that it didn't ask me for a passphrase either. The thing is, when you have already entered in the passphrase, it's quite common that your Linux distribution, if you are using Linux on your laptop or desktop, or whatever your host operating system happens to be, it is common that they will cache the key in memory. That way you don't have to keep entering the passphrase over and over. But what a passphrase actually protects you from is that if your key does get stolen, you still should regenerate the key and never use that key anymore. Because yeah, they can't use your key, they don't have the password. But if there's any way in the future for them to actually brute force the encryption, it's not really likely right now, you never know. They might find a way in later. It's just good practice to always regenerate your key, basically delete it, create a new one, anytime your key leaks out. But the passphrase is one extra layer of security. But now that I've proven that I can log in to the server, and I also have sudo access, we're good to close out of one of these tabs, because the only reason why we had both open is I wanted to keep a session alive in case I needed to fix something, but it looks like everything went through perfectly fine, so I don't need to keep that open anymore. Now, the next thing that I'm going to show you how to do, and this is actually the last thing, is I'm going to show you how to use fail2ban. Now, the thing is, fail2ban is a very complex app, so I can't show you everything in one video. And I do have a dedicated video on this already. But what I am going to do is show you how to use fail2ban to lock down SSH, because that's a good starting point. I mean, yeah, we did actually disable password authentication. We disabled root access as well. We're able to use a key, but we should lock down SSH as much as we can. And one of the cool things about fail2ban is that its use case isn't only for protecting SSH. If you have a web server running Apache, for example, you can use it to protect that too. There's actually quite a few modules for fail2ban that you could use. And perhaps this section of the video will serve as your starting point. So the first thing we want to do is install fail2ban. And to do that, we will run sudo apt install fail2ban, just like that. And it's a small program, so it should install really quickly. And that's it. Fail2ban is installed, but we're not quite done yet. Let's check the status of fail2ban to ensure that it's running. And we can see here that it is active and it's running. Let's actually see what fail2ban is protecting us from currently, if anything. So we'll run sudo and then fail2ban -client, and then we'll give it the keyword of status. And as you can see here, SSH is enabled already. That may not always be the case, but it's a great thing that all we had to do was install fail2ban, and now it's already protecting us. So what fail2ban actually does is it checks your Linux system logs for attempts to access the server. So the SSH jail, in this case, is watching the config file for SSH attempts, And if it sees too many failures, then it's going to actually ban the IP of the person that's trying to get into the server. But one thing you definitely don't want to happen is have it ban your IP, because that would be really embarrassing if you yourself gets locked out of the server. So what we're going to do is go into the etc directory and then the fail to ban directory. Inside there we have a jail.conf file. And you know what? We could edit that file and make any changes to it to configure fail to ban as we'd like, but we shouldn't actually edit that file, because if we install our updates and fail to ban itself gets updated, then that jail.conf file will also be updated and overwritten. We will lose all of our changes. So what we could do is we can copy the jail.conf file, and we could copy it to a new name of jail.local. And we actually have both files. We have jail.conf and jail.local. And the way this works is that jail.local will be preferred. If present, it doesn't have to be present, but if it is present, fail to ban will use that file. If it's not present, it's going to use jail.conf. And what that means is that we can have jail.local with all of our customizations inside that file, and we don't have to worry about it being overwritten. So let's bring it up in an editor. Just like that, and take a quick look. Now what I'm going to do is scroll down quite a bit here. Now this isn't why I had you open the file, but there's a few things to point out here. For example, ban time. So by default, if an IP gets banned, they are locked out for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, they can try to access the server again. Now if this was a hacker, that means if they get banned, then they could try again in 10 minutes. But the thing is, being locked out for 10 minutes in between attempts, or however many attempts you're configured to allow, will drastically slow them down and prevent a brute force. And down here we have max retry equals 5. So what this means is that if someone is accessing the server via a service that fail to ban is watching and they fail 5 times, then their IP gets banned. If their IP gets banned, then they're going to actually get banned for 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, of course, their banning is lifted and they are able to access the server again. So you could set this to 60 minutes if you'd like, or whatever you think is fair. Just keep in mind, if you get locked out, you also might have to wait that amount of time. I'll leave it up to you to configure those. Again, that's not why we're here, but just something to point out. And now we have this line right here, ignore IP. This is the one that I really want you to think about. So I'm going to uncomment this, and we're going to leave the localhost IPs alone. But what I recommend you do is you add your public IP or whatever IP address it is that you're coming from when you access your servers via SSH, and you add that IP address here. And what that protects you from is having that IP get banned. Any IP that you put here will never be banned, regardless of how many times you try to access the server. So that way, you don't have to worry about you yourself going beyond those 5 attempts and being locked out for 10 minutes, or more than 10 minutes if you have that set to something else. You basically put your IP here, again, the IP you're coming from, so that way you don't have to worry about getting banned. And you can add other IP addresses here as well. For example, if you have a VPN endpoint, you can add the IP address here for that. So that way, if you are coming from a VPN service, and that VPN service uses a predictable IP, then you have a way into the server that'll protect you from you yourself getting blocked. But I'll leave it up to you to add your IP address here. It's just a good idea, and I recommend you do that. As you can see, with just a few quick tweaks, you can increase the security of your Linux server as we've done in this video. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. I'll get working on episode 3 very soon, but in the meantime, make sure that you subscribe if you haven't already done so, and also click that like button if you did like this video. That lets YouTube know that you want to see more Linux content just like this. Thank you so much for watching.